You ready, Matthew? Okay, here we go. It's Tuesday night, everybody. That means it's time for second look study. And we're glad that you have joined us via live stream. We have a company of friends here. And so we're going to get back on track. We've been a little off track for a couple weeks. We did a review last week and the week before. We were not live streaming, so we did something, as Monty Python says, completely different that night. But we're back on track. We're in Revelation 7, talking about the 144,000. So where we are thus far, and I think everybody present, you probably have your study guide. We've just about finished it, except for 2 questions at the end. But where we are so far is we have looked at chapter 7, which is one of the 2 passages that deals with the mysterious 144,000. The other is in Revelation 14, and we have dabbled in that. We'll come back to that later, but those are the 2 principal passages that deal with it. And should we look at this group of people literally, metaphorically? We talked about in the listing of the 144,000, which are the tribes, listed 12,000, 12,000, 12,000. Why are Joseph and Manasseh mentioned? We talked about why is Dan omitted. And why is this tribal arrangement there at all? Do they represent the church, the 12 apostles? Are they specifically protected? Anyway, we've dealt with a number of things. What we found out is that in all probability, what John is doing is he's taking us back to some Old Testament passages where the tribes were numbered and the different reasons that tribes were numbered, sometimes for taxation purposes. You would take a census. Sometimes it was a labor conscription thing. We've got a project and I need so many from this tribe and so many from this tribe and so on. So it was a labor issue. Sometimes it was laying out different duties of the different tribes, the social structure, most especially of the Levites and their duties. Sometimes it was to determine their descent, their Israelite bona fides. Are you a genuine member of Israel? And if so, what tribe, what clan, so on. So sometimes they would number. We've even got a book in the Bible where it talks about the numbering, the book of Numbers, and it talks about these census times. And so what we're looking at in chapter 7 with the numbering, especially of the 144,000 by tribe, is we're looking at another one of those census deals, and it's very probable that what we're looking at here was something that we see in the Old Testament and John is hooking back to, and that is a time of numbering, a census taking for the purpose of determining military strength. And so what we've got in Revelation 7, Revelation 14, with this numbering of the tribes that totals 144,000, is it's some kind of reference to what it most often is in the Old Testament, which is some kind of a military strength thing, okay? So it's for military purposes that this census in Revelation is, and we should think of it as a census, has been taken here. Because when you go to Revelation 14, the other mention in Revelation of the 144,000, you see that it is all adult males, and requiring sexual abstinence, which was a requirement when Israel went to holy war. It would require that mark of purity, and you get the same thing in Revelation 14. So that all that together causes us to say what we're probably looking at here in this numbering of the 144,000 is something to do with military purposes, okay? Also, there's some parallels to what we see here in chapter 7, especially the numbering, with what is known as the War Scroll in the Dead Sea Scrolls. There is one of the scrolls that's come to be known as the War Scroll, and it's a scroll that talks about, or a document that talks about, a war between gods and men. And you've got gods on both sides, and you've got men on both sides, on the good side and on the bad side in the War Scroll. And so some people have considered this Revelation 7, this numbering 144,000 for military purposes, at least partly for military purposes, to be kind of like a Christian war scroll. But it may be that the mention of the 12 tribes, and we'll get off this is all review and get on to new stuff. It may be that this numbering, this census taken, this 144,000 in chapter 7 of Revelation may point to the restoration of Israel. That may be part of what we're talking about. I favor the idea that we're probably not looking at one or the other, but both. It's something to do with military purposes, but it's in the battle between good and evil, but it's also got something to do, it's signaling the restoration of Israel. Because there are definitely indicators in it that it's a hope of restoration type text. So anyway, but our two questions that remain, and let's spend today talking about these two questions. Two things that stand out. We've talked about the tribal arrangement, but two questions that remain have to do with the identity. Who are they? And are they specially protected? So, let's go back. Put your thumb in Revelation 7. And I want you to turn to a passage that almost certainly John is borrowing from. And that is Ezekiel 9, verses 1 through 6. And so put your thumb in Revelation 7 and put your thumb in Ezekiel 9, because we're going to flip back and forth. We're going to be involved in both. So let's refer to this Revelation 7 first, just to refresh, because it's been about 3 or 4 weeks. Verse 4. I heard the number of those who were sealed. Now that's a key word. We're going to see that word repeated tonight. And I heard the number of those who were sealed, 144,000, sealed from every tribe of the sons of Israel. So you got the word sealed there 2 times. From the tribe of Judah, 12,000. And we won't read through all this census, because essentially it's the same. For every tribe mentioned, and again, we dealt with the issue of why Joseph and not the usual pairing of Manasseh and Ephraim, and why the omission of Dan. Very simply put, the omission of Dan was probably just to keep the 12 theme going. No slight on Dan. And that's unfortunate, because that's one of the tribes that's easy to pronounce. But it's probably left out simply to keep the integrity of the 12 idea. Anyway, there you've got all that numbering. Verse 8 ends up with Zebulun, Joseph, Benjamin, 12,000 in every case were sealed. Let's just dabble in verse number 9, because we hopefully will get to it tonight. And after these things, John says, I looked, and behold, a great multitude, which no one could count. Okay, so you've got this countable group, 144,000, but here you've got this uncountable group. A great multitude which no one could count, from every nation and all tribes and peoples and tongues, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed in white robes. Palm branches were in their hands. So we know the clothing, they're wearing the uniform of the redeemed, okay, of God's children. And a cry went up with a loud voice, saying, salvation to our God who sits on the throne and to the Lamb. So this 144,000, they are loyal to the Lamb, to Christ. But we're going to find out, so is this great multitude that cannot be counted. All right? So our question is, first question, who are the 144,000? It's an identification question. It is almost certain, and I believe it is certain, that the sealing of the saints that we just read about in Revelation 7, and that mention is in verse 2 and 3, is almost certainly borrowed, modeled, repurposed from Ezekiel 9, specifically Ezekiel 9, 4 through 6. But I want us to go through all the first 6 verses of Ezekiel 9 to give you kind of the full passage. So here it is. Ezekiel 9, verse 1. Then he cried in my ears with a loud voice. We've heard this loud voice language in Revelation before, right? Saying, bring near the executioners of the city. Now in chapter 8 of Ezekiel, you get a vision of the abominations of the people. There are abominations in the temple, and there's all kind of stuff. You can go back and read Ezekiel 8 yourself, that the people are doing wrong. God is angry with them. Again, you can read it for yourself, but that's what you get in 8, and that's the setup for 9. And so there's all this abomination going on, and then in the middle of it all, Ezekiel hears the voice of God. Okay? Then he cried in my ears with a loud voice, that he is God, saying, bring near the executioners of the city, each with his destroying weapon in his hand. And behold, 6 men came from the direction of the upper gate, which faces north, each with his weapon for slaughter in his hand. And with them was a man clothed in linen with a writing case at his waist. Then he went in and stood beside the bronze altar. Now Ezekiel is assuming that we have pretty good familiarity with the temple layout here. Now go on to verse number 3. Now the glory of the God of Israel had gone up from the cherub. Remember the cherubim? When we talked all about the nature and the function and the job description of these different kinds of divine beings called Elohim. We call them gods, but it means divine beings. And there are different kinds. Angels are one kind. Spirits are another kind. But there's a kind called the cherubim, the seraphim. Cherubim is the ancient Near Eastern way of thinking of it. Seraphim is the Egyptian way, but they're the same thing. And what was their function? They were throne guardians, remember? That's why you see them sitting on top of the mercy seat on the throne of God, on top of the Ark of the Covenant. They are guarding the throne. They're the ones who, these powerful guardians, and we think of cherub because of Hallmark as fat little flying babies. That's not the idea in this text. They are almost fearsome in their function. They are powerful throne guardians. They are the ones who determine access to the presence of God. Okay? Who gets in, who keeps out. And so that's who these are. Now the glory of the God of Israel had gone up from the cherub on which it rested to the threshold of the house. And he, the cherub, called to the man clothed in linen who had the writing case at his waist. And the Lord said to him, now here's one of those cases where you get the parallel. The cherub is speaking, that means the Lord is speaking. And it's L-O-R-D, all caps, so we're talking Yahweh. And the Lord said to him, pass through the city, through Jerusalem, and here it is, put a mark on the foreheads of the men who sigh and groan over all the abominations that are committed in it. So these are people that are distressed. They're upset. They're unsettled. They're distressed over all the abominations that are going on in the city that are talked about in chapter 8. Put a mark on their foreheads, these ones that are not in collusion with all of this chaos in the city. Verse 5, and to the others he said in my hearing, pass through the city after him, after that first one, and strike. Your eye will not spare, and you will show no pity. Kill old men outright, young men, maidens, little children, women. But, here's our sentence, but touch no one on whom is the mark. And begin at my sanctuary. So they began with the elders who were before the house. Some of the leaders were the first to go. Okay? But there is this contingent that has a mark. That's what I want us to kind of drill down on. So there's your first 6 verses. So you have this judgment scene in Ezekiel. And basically it's for those that are completely apostate. There's no hope of return for them. The die has been cast. They have gone over to the other side. Complete apostasy, and it's a judgment scene on them. And that includes some in the priesthood and some that function in the temple. Notice that? And others in the city. Okay? It's pretty hard not to see when you look at Revelation 7, then you look back at Ezekiel 9, these first 6 verses, not to see this is John's point of reference. He's hooking back into Ezekiel 9 to explain what he's seeing in Revelation 7. Because the 144,000 get sealed, don't they? They get a mark. They get a seal of some kind. And so, look at this passage again, 4 through 6. This is a reference to the identifying mark. Go through the city, through Jerusalem, and put a mark. Put a mark. So there's some kind of ID here, some identifier here, on the foreheads of those who sigh and groan over all the abominations that are committed in it. Cut them all down, but touch no one, and that even includes priests and those that serve in the temple, but touch no one who has the mark. Okay? Now compare that with what we looked at in Revelation 7, especially verses 2 and 3. I saw another angel ascending from the rising of the sun, having the seal of the living God. And he called with a loud voice. There's that loud voice thing again. Ezekiel was spoken to with a loud voice. And he called with a loud voice to the 4 angels who had been given power to damage the earth and the sea, saying, do not damage the earth or the sea or the trees until we have marked the servants of our God with a seal. Where? On their foreheads. Okay? So it's real hard to miss what John is doing here. He's taking us back to that. He's repurposing it for what he's got to do. Now, it might be of interest to you to know that later traditions looked at this sealing, this mark, and they identified it sometimes with baptism. This is not New Testament, but post-New Testament Christians, early church. They identified it with baptism. They identified this mark, this sealing, with the laying on of hands or the marking of the cross on the forehead. That's much later, a later Christian tradition. And it may be that they do this because of what Paul does. In 2 Corinthians 1, in Ephesians 1, Ephesians 4, he talks about the seal. He talks about a seal that's placed on people, a seal of the Holy Spirit or something like that. And maybe that's where these later traditions come along and say, oh, well, what's happening in Revelation 7, that mark is their baptism. That mark is the laying on of hands. That mark is a marking of the cross on their forehead. There's really no Bible for that, but it may be that they get it from what Paul is doing when he talks about a seal. But it seems pretty clear that what John is doing here, his meaning is closer to what Ezekiel is doing than something like a baptism or laying on of hands or sign of the cross or something like that. Paul has a sealing thing going on here for some sort of purpose that's different. And what John's doing aligns with what Ezekiel is doing. When Paul is talking about people being sealed, somehow marked, they're not being protected physically from something in his case when Paul's talking about it. John seems to be going in the direction of Ezekiel. It's a mark for protection. Okay? The 144,000, the people that are in, that are grieved over what's going on in Ezekiel, they seem to be marked for some kind of protection. So John is going with Ezekiel, not Paul. I just bring that up because a lot of times people will say, oh, it's baptism, it's laying on of hands or a mark of the Holy Spirit or something. I think John is consistently looking back at Ezekiel. So it's some kind of mark for protection of some kind. John's meaning is closer to Ezekiel's than Paul. So, again, what is it? God's people are to be given a mark, special mark, to protect them from the approaching slaughter. In Ezekiel, it's reasonable to say that's similar to what's going on in Revelation. Somebody take a look in Revelation 8:5, because this causes us to say John is aligning with Ezekiel. It's another indicator that he's aligning with Ezekiel. Somebody read Revelation 8:5, because it's a kind of another point of interest. The sealing episode that we're reading about in Revelation 7 with the 144,000, it is followed by an angel who comes on the scene, reaches into the altar, and hurls fire to the earth. Somebody read Revelation 8:5 if you got it. Leon, you got it?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
And the angel took the censer and filled it with fire of the altar and cast it into the earth. And there were voices and thunder and lightnings and earthquakes.
If you look in Ezekiel, we're in chapter 9, but if you look in Ezekiel 10, verse 2, you see something similar. He said to the man clothed in linen, "Go within the wheelwork underneath the cherubim," the throne guardians. "Fill your hands with burning coals from among the cherubim and scatter them over the city." Very similar to what we see in Revelation 8:5 is what we see in Ezekiel 10:2. So what we're doing here is we're trying to figure out, why is John using this passage, and he's repurposing it, but what's his point? Here's what's so far is clear, or should be clear. It would seem clear that the sealing is drawn from this Jewish text, Ezekiel 9, and there are wider Jewish contexts. We've already looked at the tribes and the census. What's it pointing to? Restoration of the tribes. So this is furthering that kind of narrative, okay? That Israel is going to be restored, restoration of the tribes. Now, why is this important? It's important for identifying who the 144,000 are, because there are different opinions, and we're going to get into that. There are many people that think in Revelation 7, verses 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, it's based on a Jewish source, and in answering the specifically who question, it's based on a Jewish source, and there are people that see that, and they hold that while the 144,000 may have originally referred to Jews or Israel, ethnic Israel, there are people that read that and say, yes, that's what it originally referred to, but it's been reinterpreted now, and it's talking about the Christian church, or it's talking about Christian martyrs when it mentions the 144,000. So let's get into the specifics of the who, okay? So what we've got here is a difference of opinion. There's some people who say the 144,000, and that's our question, who are these? That they are Jews. There are other people that say, no, they are non-Jews. They are Christians, okay? Now, we got to be real careful with our terms, but what we've got is a difference of opinion. I got to be honest with you, among commentators, there's a difference of opinion. But let's see if we can figure out what John is doing to help us settle who these people are. So, what we sometimes get is an odd conflating, putting together of the two terms Christian and Jew. Jew is an ethnic term. Christian is a spiritual term. And it's very easy if we look at passages like this and say, oh, it's talking about Christians, that we forget that many of the first Christians were ethnically Jewish. Okay? So again, who is this that we're looking at here? What I'm saying is they should not be mutually exclusive terms necessarily. I mean, you can still be a Christian, a believer, and be a Jew or a non-Jew, right? In that day and our day. But historically, the history The way interpreters have looked at this is scholars have looked at this passage and say ethnic Jews are one group and Christians are another group. Well, not necessarily. Exhibit A, Paul the Apostle. Exhibit B, all the rest of the apostles. They were Jews and Christians. And they didn't stop being Jews to become Christians. It's an ethnic term. It's a spiritual term. I mean, if they're followers of Jesus, they're Christians, right? But it seems like a lot of people don't ask that kind of question. Let me take just a minute here. What some people do with a passage like this is they propound an idea that's become a doctrine that's become really in Christian churches for a long time, and I'm talking hundreds of years, has said that Israel is replaced by the church. What this idea is known as supersessionism, that the church supersedes, takes the place of the nation of Israel. And that is the predominant view among most Bible-believing Christians today, that God is done with Israel and that it's the church now. That because, maybe for a lot of reasons, maybe the declaration on the day of crucifixion, his blood be on us and on our children, they take that as a jumping off point for saying, well, then God, bleh. And now this is the new Israel. That's known as supersessionism. I don't believe that's what the Bible says. If you read Romans 9, 10, and 11, Paul is struggling with the reality, even in his own day, that not enough Jewish people are embracing Christ as the Messiah. Now, he may have had the idea that within his lifetime, there would be a lot of Jewish people like himself and like his fellow apostles who would say, I get it. He is our Messiah. But he's also the Messiah for the whole world. And Paul is wrestling in 9, 10, and 11 of Romans with the fact that it's not happening as quickly as he would have hoped or maybe he thought. So what do we do? Does that mean that God has transferred his attention, his loyalty, his protection, his plan from the Jews to the church? And Paul says no. God still has a living covenant. And he does that whole discussion about the olive tree and those that have been grafted in and so on. And he ends up by saying he doesn't know how it's going to happen, but all Israel will be saved. In other words, God has not abandoned Israel. But in spite of some of those clear things that he's talking about in 9, 10, 11 of Romans, still the overwhelming majority of Bible teachers today, commentators today, Bible believers today are taught that God is done with Israel and he's replaced Israel with the church. And that's where an idea like what I just said can flower. That the 144,000 originally in Ezekiel, it is Jewish people. But John has repurposed it now and he means Christians. And by that definition, Christian means not Jewish. Okay? So you've got imprecision of terms there, and you've got assumptions that the text doesn't support, but that is kind of the predominant view. Okay, so that makes it really important. Who are the 144,000? Okay? There are people that say the 144,000 are not Jews. They see it very black and white. But I want us to look a little bit closer and see if we can kind of tease some of this out. You've got a real detailed enumeration of 12,000 sealed from each of the 12 tribes of Israel. And that suggests that they are Jews. And the fact that they have allegiance to the Lamb suggests that they are Jewish Christians. Okay? Otherwise, why would you go to the trouble to list all of those tribes by name, right? Which we spent a bit of time on. So there's that. What I think is the 144,000, and I think the text supports this, and I think John is purposely borrowing from Ezekiel 9 to convey this idea, and the listing of the 12 tribes, which is a military phrasing. And we say that because in the Old Testament, when they counted them for military purposes, they usually put Judah first, and that's what we've got in Revelation 7. So there's that military flavor, but not exclusively. The listing of the tribes, the census taking, it also seems to indicate some kind of restoration of Israel at the end times. So I think they're ethnic Jews, but they're followers of the Lamb. That's very, very clear in the passage. So they're believers. They're Jewish Christians is the way I would categorize them. Now, Paul, in Romans 9, 10, 11, as I said, he struggled with the problem that there seemed to be a rejection on the part of some Jews, maybe even most Jews that he knew, of Jesus as the Messiah. And he recognized that everybody descended from Israel doesn't belong to the true Israel. He says that in Romans 9:6. Nevertheless, he held out this end-time hope that Israel would eventually be converted, would embrace Christ. He believed that that would happen. He talks about that in Romans 11, 25, 26, 27. That's where he says all Israel will be saved. So what have we got here? You've got different ways to look at it. One way is that all ethnic Jews have nothing to do with their status as Christians. Doesn't seem possible that we're just talking about ethnic Jews that are non-Christians because it says they're followers of the Lamb. Okay? And the Lamb is Jesus. Another way it's looked at is they're all Christians with no Jewish ethnicity. Again, that doesn't seem right to me because you've got this mention of the tribes, you've got this restoration of Israel hinted at, and their Jewish ethnicity is mentioned. So that doesn't seem quite right, that it's a replacement thing going on. I think they're ethnic Jews, but they're Christians too. So those are some different ways that you can look at it. When you get to verse 9, and that's why I included it in what we read in Revelation 7, if you look at verse 9, Revelation 7, you've got this massive multitude, okay? It says from every tribe, every nation, ethne, the nations again. There's that theme, okay? And so what you've got here in Revelation 7 is effectively two groups, the 144,000, which are Jewish, and this massive larger group in Revelation 7, 9, but they're both on the same side. They are both followers of the Lamb. That to me doesn't seem to be like such a big dilemma. That here in this end time scene, we would see Jewish Jesus followers and non-Jewish Jesus followers from every tribe, nation, and that they would be on the same side. In fact, that makes perfect sense to me, right? And it perfectly aligns with what Paul talks about with the breaking down of the dividing walls, and there is no Jew, there is no Greek, there is no male, there is no female. Are there differences? Yes, there are differences. But while there are differences in this new kingdom, there's no discrimination. And so the interpretation that the 144,000, and that's our question, who are these people? They are Jewish Jesus followers, makes perfect sense to me. But what's going on with the mark? Okay? What's going on with the mark? Because the mark is given to them, and it's not something that's part of everybody else. Again, the 144,000, the larger multitude from every tribe and tongue and nation, they're all loyal to the Lamb. So what John is doing here is he's repurposing the census stuff, the tribe stuff, the Ezekiel 9 stuff. Everything is kind of pointing in that direction, that all are together here. Next week we're going to push a little bit further, and there's some references to Levitical stuff, and which possibly connects to the idea of the watchers, which we've talked about before. These divine beings known as the watchers. Anyway, we'll hit that next time. So you've got a spiritual label, you've got followers of the Lamb, Christians, but you've got an ethnic label, Jews, also followers of the Lamb. But let's look at the other part of the question, which is, do they receive special protection? Okay? So let's spend just a few minutes. Are the 144,000 specially protected? No surprise, there's more than one view on this too. Why God seals his servants is kind of a debated thing. That's the way it's described in Revelation 7, that he seals them. And you've got a couple of basic alternatives when you think of that. They're sealed from protection from physical harm, and protection from demons, and protection from losing their faith. Okay? So there's this mark put on them that protects them from physical harm, protects them from demonic harm, and protects them from losing their faith, and that would be the loss of their salvation, of course. The seal of God that we see here, well, let's jump ahead. Look in verse 4 of Ezekiel 9. Somebody read, we've read it, but somebody read it again. 9:4 of Ezekiel.
And the Lord said unto him, Go through the midst of the city, through the midst of Jerusalem, and set a mark upon their foreheads of the men that sigh and that cry for the abominations that be done in the midst thereof.
If you look carefully, God explicitly here provides special protection from the wrath of God that's coming on that situation. Chapter 8, Ezekiel. Wrath of God is coming. These people that are on God's side, they receive this mark, this seal, and it protects them from the wrath of God. But there's no explicit indication that these people that are sealed are protected from the wrath of the ungodly. Okay? In a lot of early Christian texts, the end time thought was that they would be protected from everything. But that's not quite what we see here. Okay? There's a little bit more to it than that. Spiritual protection of the Israelite faithful is certainly talked about in Ezekiel 9. It's talked about in Exodus as well, that the faithful are protected. But uppermost in John's mind, I don't think is necessarily physical security, but it's protection of their faith and the believers from protection of their salvation, and that sort of thing, whether by Satan or demonic activity or earthly agents. So you kind of get a flavor of all that. I think we're going to stop because we've covered a lot of ground already. And as I said, next week we'll push on. We'll look at, there's a Levitical connection to all of this, which causes us to make a pretty good connection to these characters called the Watchers that we've mentioned before, divine beings. So we'll table that for next week because it gets a little involved. And we'll sign off for our friends that are watching via live stream. And just so you'll know, if you're watching live stream, one of the advantages of being in person is we do a little bonus. We sit down and chat for a minute, and we don't include you because we're not mic'd to do that. But if